An old mechanic's trembling hands tightened a bolt, while a group of rich men laughed at his grease-stained clothes. But when one man quietly stood up and said, "If he doesn't work, none of you would be driving," the entire garage fell silent. No one realized it was Keanu Reeves. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The morning sun had barely lifted above the dusty ridge when the metallic growl of an engine shattered the calm. A sleek black sports car rolled into Mallory's auto service, its polished surface gleaming like a mirror against the cracked concrete floor. Inside, the air smelled of motor oil and sweat, the kind of scent only hard work could make. Frank Mallory, 68 years old, stood near the workbench. His faded blue coveralls bore years of stains, the kind that never washed out but told stories of loyalty, patience, and grit. His silver hair curled slightly under his cap. When he smiled, the creases around his eyes deepened marks of both time and kindness. He wiped his calloused hands on a dirty rag and approached the car. The door opened, and 3 young men stepped out, all in designer clothes. Their sunglasses reflected the neon open sign. Their watches glittered brighter than the morning Sunday. One of them, Ryan Huxley, a wealthy tech investor in his early 30s, gave the shop a slow, judgmental look. "Wow," he muttered. "Did we just time travel to 1980? His friends laughed. The sound echoed off the metal walls, sharp and mocking. Frank offered a polite nod, pretending not to hear. He'd been in this position too many times, people mistaking dirt for incompetence. "How can I help you, gentlemen?" Frank asked. His tone was steady, respectful. Ryan tossed his car keys onto the counter with a smirk. "Yeah, this beauty needs a tune-up. But, are you sure this place can handle something like this?" He glanced at the peeling paint on the walls and the rusted air compressor in the corner. "Does this place even have Wi-Fi?" His friends laughed again, one snapping a photo of Frank's workbench like it was some kind of relic. The laughter hit Frank like sandpaper. He'd learned to let it roll off, but today, something about the cruelty felt heavier. In the back of the garage, sitting quietly at a small wooden table, a man in a dark jacket and baseball cap stirred his coffee. His hands were relaxed, his face half hidden by the brim. Keanu Reeves had stopped by on his way through town, his motorcycle parked outside beside a line of dusty pickup trucks. He wasn't there to be recognized. He liked small places like this, the kind of places where people worked with their hands and didn't pretend to be something they weren't. But as he watched the scene unfold, his calm began to shift. Frank bent under the hood, his movements deliberate and practiced. Years of experience guided him, every turn of the wrench confident. Ryan's friend muttered under his breath, "Bet he doesn't even know how to plug in a diagnostic tool." Keanu's eyes narrowed slightly. He knew that tone. The same tone people used when they thought wealth made them superior. He'd heard it in Hollywood, in boardrooms, and behind closed doors. But here, in this small-town garage, it stung differently. The mockery continued. "Look at his hands," one of them whispered. "You could scrape a wall with those." Frank pretended not to notice, but his shoulders sagged. Years of holding and humiliation left invisible bruises. He reached for a wrench, the rag slipping slightly from his hand. That was when Keanu set his cup down. The faint sound of ceramic against wood sliced through the laughter. All eyes turned toward the quiet corner where he stood. He rose slowly, not with anger, but with purpose. His voice carried through the room steady, deep, impossible to ignore. "If men like him stopped working," he said, "none of you would be driving." The words landed with the weight of truth. For a moment, nobody spoke. The laughter died. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade. Ryan blinked, caught off guard by the stranger's calm authority. Frank froze, his wrench still in hand. The shop fell into a silence that felt alive, tense, uncertain, but charged with something powerful. The man in the jacket stepped forward, light catching his face. And as recognition dawned, jaws dropped. It was Keanu Reeves. The air inside the garage seemed to thicken after Keanu spoke. The wealthy men exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to laugh or stay quiet. Their arrogance, once so loud, now trembled in the echo of his calm words. Ryan forced a smirk. "Hey, relax, man. We were just joking. Didn't mean anything by it." Keanu's eyes met his, steady and unblinking. "You weren't joking. You were judging." His voice wasn't raised, yet it carried a quiet strength that filled the room. "And you judged the wrong man." Frank slowly straightened, wiping his hands again, though they were already clean. His heart pounded. He had seen many faces come and go in this garage, but never anyone like this. Someone who spoke up for him, not out of pity, but respect. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. "All right, whatever," he said, rolling his eyes. "Let's just get the car fixed." But one of his friends whispered, "That's Keanu Reeves, man." Ryan turned, squinting. For a second, disbelief flickered in his eyes. Then recognition. The man in the jacket, the calm voice, the unmistakable look. It was really him. "Wait, hold on," Ryan stammered, suddenly nervous. You're actually Keanu Reeves?" Keanu gave a small nod, unfazed. "Just another customer." The words disarmed them. He didn't posture or demand attention. He simply stood there, grounded, as if fame had nothing to do with the moment. Ryan chuckled awkwardly, trying to regain footing. "Man, I loved your movies. Didn't expect to see you in a place like this." Keanu looked around the modest garage, the cracked windows, the scattered tools, the faint smell of gasoline that never truly left the air. "Places like this remind me of real life," he said quietly. Frank's lips trembled into a faint smile. He wasn't sure what to say. His whole career had been built on staying invisible, just fixing things and letting others take the credit. But now, this stranger, this famous actor, had turned the spotlight on him without warning. Ryan's friend nudged him, whispering something under his breath. Ryan nodded slightly, pretending to laugh again, but the humor had drained from his face. Keanu stepped closer to Frank. "You've been doing this long?" he asked. Frank blinked. "Since I was 17. My dad taught me. Been under hoods longer than most people have been alive." Keanu smiled. "That's something to be proud of." The silence that followed was different now, not awkward, but reflective. Even the wealthy men seemed unsure of themselves. They looked at Frank differently, though pride kept them from admitting it. Outside, the wind rattled a loose sheet of metal on the roof, filling the pause with its low hum. Frank turned away, embarrassed by the attention. He murmured, "It's just a job, really." Keanu shook his head. "No, it's what keeps the world moving." And just like that, something shifted in the room. The air lightened. Respect replaced mockery. For the first time that morning, Frank stood a little taller, unaware that his ordinary day had just turned into something extraordinary. Ryan finally broke the silence, his voice quieter now. "Didn't mean to offend anyone. Guess we just didn't think." Keanu nodded. "Most people don't, until they're reminded who keeps the world turning." His tone was gentle, but every word carried weight. He turned toward Frank, who was still standing near the workbench, his hands trembling slightly. "That's something no one should laugh at." Frank's throat tightened. People don't see it that way anymore. They see oil and rust, not years of learning. Keanu smiled faintly. Then maybe it's time someone showed them. He picked up a wrench from the counter, its handle darkened from years of use, and handed it back to Frank like a symbol of quiet honor. The old man took it slowly, his fingers curling around it as if reclaiming part of himself. Ryan looked away, his confidence gone. His friends stayed silent, staring at the floor. What began as mockery had turned into a lesson none of them expected. Keanu placed a few bills on the counter for his coffee and repairs, then turned toward the exit. Before leaving, he looked back once more. "Keep doing what you do, Frank. The world still needs hands like yours." As the door swung open, the sunlight poured in, glinting off the grease-streaked floor and the rows of worn tools. Frank stood frozen, the wrench still in his hand, watching Keanu Reeves walk into the light like something out of a dream. The garage fell completely silent. Only the ticking sound of the cooling engine filled the space. Ryan exhaled slowly, his voice barely audible. He really meant that, didn't he? Frank nodded, his eyes glistening. Every word. Outside, Keanu slipped on his sunglasses and started his motorcycle. The engine purred a clean, honest sound built from the same kind of hands that had just been mocked. As he rode away, dust swirled in the sunlight like fragments of a new beginning. For Frank Mallory, that morning changed everything. The humiliation still stung, but beneath it was something stronger, a quiet pride returning after years of being dismissed. He looked down at his rough, oil-stained hands and smiled for the first time in months. Somewhere, deep inside, a thought stirred like a spark under steel. Maybe, just maybe, the world still respected people like him. The day after Keanu's visit, the garage felt different. The laughter from those rich men still echoed faintly in Frank's head, but so did Keanu's words. If men like him stopped working, none of you would be driving. That line played over and over, softening something inside him that had grown hard from years of being overlooked. That night, Frank drove home in his old red pickup. The truck rattled with every turn, but he loved it anyway. He had rebuilt it 3 times since buying it new in 1979, and every dent on its body held a story. The headlights cut through the dusk as he pulled into the gravel driveway of his small one-story home on the edge of town. Inside, the house was quiet. The walls were lined with faded photographs and memories of another life. On a shelf rested a framed picture of Mary Ann, his late wife, smiling in her nurse's uniform. She had passed away from cancer 15 years earlier, and though time had dulled the grief, the house never stopped feeling empty without her laughter. Next to her photo sat another frame, his daughter Lisa, now 38, holding her own little boy in her arms. She lived in Oregon, working as a teacher. She called every Sunday, and every Sunday, Frank told her he was fine. He sat at the kitchen table, a bowl of canned soup steaming in front of him, and looked at the photos again. He thought about how different his life had been. Once how, in his 40s, he had run Mallory Auto and Repair, the best small garage in the county. Customers lined up for his work. He was known for honesty, for never overcharging a soul. His shop was his pride, his second home. Then came Roadmaster Auto, a chain garage with neon lights, glossy floors, and weekend discounts. One by one, his loyal customers disappeared, drawn by convenience and marketing. Within 2 years, Frank couldn't keep up. He sold most of his tools just to pay off debts. When the bank took the building, he moved into this smaller house and started working for Miller's Garage, grateful to still have a wrench in his hand. He'd told no one, but that day broke him a little. He remembered standing outside his old shop after handing over the keys, the smell of oil and rubber still in the air, watching strangers walk through the doors he'd built with his own 2 hands. He had shaken the buyer's hand with dignity, but the second he got home, he'd cried in his truck where no one could see. Now, years later, he still worked every day. He refused to retire, not because of the money, but because of purpose. "If I stop fixing," he once said to Lisa on the phone, "I'll stop breathing." She had sighed gently. "Dad, you've done enough for everyone. Maybe it's time to take it easy." But Frank didn't know how to take it easy. Frank woke early every morning, before the sun broke through the fog. He brewed a pot of strong coffee, the same brand he'd used for decades, and packed his old metal lunchbox, a sandwich, an apple, and a thermos. His hands trembled slightly now from age, but they were still strong enough to hold a wrench steady. Before heading out, he always stopped by the garage behind his house. It wasn't much anymore, just a single bay with peeling paint and tools he'd collected over 50 years. In the corner sat a half-repaired motorcycle. He'd been fixing it for a neighbor's son, a young Marine who'd lost a leg overseas. The boy couldn't afford a professional job, so Frank told him it was practice. The truth was, he didn't want the kid to feel like a charity case. Helping others had become Frank's quiet mission. Every Thursday, he repaired cars for single mothers who needed them to get to work. On weekends, he checked veterans' vehicles for free. Sometimes, people left pies or gas cards as thanks. Sometimes, they left nothing at all. But Frank never kept score. "A man who helps others never goes broke," he liked to say. Still, there were nights when exhaustion hit him hard. His knees ached, and his back screamed after long hours under the lift. The town respected him, but the younger generation often didn't see that. They saw his greasy overalls, his rusted pickup, and assumed he was just another old man who'd been left behind. One evening, while refilling his coffee at the diner, Frank overheard two teenagers talking. One said, "You know that old guy at Miller's? He's still working. Dude should retire already." They laughed. Frank didn't say anything. He just stirred his coffee and smiled faintly, pretending not to hear. There was a time he might have taken offense, but now he simply pitied how little they understood. They'd grown up in a world where things were replaced, not repaired. If something broke, they bought a new one. But Frank believed fixing was sacred. Fixing meant caring enough to make something whole again. Back at the garage, after everyone else had gone home, he often stayed behind, tuning engines just to hear them purr. He'd talk to the machines softly, almost like old friends. "You're good as new," he'd murmur, patting a hood before switching off the lights. Sometimes, after long days, he'd drive past his old shop, the one he lost, and see the bright sign of Roadmaster Auto glowing in the dark. A wave of sadness always came, but so did something else: pride. Because even if the name on the sign wasn't his anymore, the spirit of his work lived on in every engine he'd ever touched. As he headed home under the fading streetlights, he never realized that soon someone would see his worth again, and this time, the whole world would too. Late that night, Frank sat out on his small porch, a blanket around his shoulders and a soft radio hum playing from the kitchen. The street was quiet, except for the occasional passing truck. His neighbor's porch lights flickered off one by one until only his remained. He liked the silence. It reminded him of the garage after everyone went home. Peaceful, predictable. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the stars. Mary Ann used to sit there with him, her head resting on his shoulder, teasing him about how he could spend hours staring at the same night sky. "You look for constellations," she used to say, "but all I see is a man trying to fix what's too far to reach." He smiled at the memory, though it ached inside. A framed photo rested on the table beside him, Lisa and her son at a lake, the child grinning with his first fishing rod. He whispered softly, "You'd be proud, Mary Ann. She's strong, just like you." The wind rustled through the maple trees, and for a moment, Frank closed his eyes, letting the sound take him back to better years when the shop was full, when laughter filled the air instead of echoes. He could still hear the clink of tools, the rumble of engines, and his younger self humming old country songs as he worked. Those sounds had been his life's rhythm. He thought about quitting sometimes. His body told him to. The ache in his hands, the stiffness in his back, it all whispered that his time was done, but his heart never listened. Every time he fixed a car and heard the engine come alive, it reminded him that he still mattered. Machines had always given him that proof of purpose. He turned off the porch light and stepped inside. On his refrigerator, held by an old magnet, was a thank you note written in crayon. It came from a single mother whose car he had fixed last Christmas. "Thank you, Mr. Mallory," it read. "You helped me get to work so I can buy my kids gifts. You're a hero." He traced the letters with his rough finger, then stood in the quiet kitchen for a long moment. Hero. He didn't feel like one, but maybe, in small ways, he was. The next morning, he'd wake up, pack his lunch again, and drive to the garage like always. He didn't know that the man who defended him yesterday wasn't done with his story yet. Keanu Reeves had seen something in Frank Mallory that the world had forgotten, and soon, that simple act of kindness would change everything. The sound of metal clinking filled the garage again, but this time it was sharp, uneasy. The young men still stood near the luxury cars they'd brought in, their smug faces showing disbelief that someone like Keanu Reeves had chosen to defend an old mechanic. Ryan Huxley's eyes flicked between Keanu and Frank with a smirk that masked his bruised pride. "You're seriously defending this guy?" Ryan scoffed. He's covered in oil. Look at him." Keanu didn't move. He met Ryan's stare calmly, his voice steady and clear. "That oil is what keeps your cars running. It's called hard work." The quiet strength in his tone was like a hammer striking steel. Ryan laughed dryly, but it came out weaker than he intended. "Man, you're really making this a thing, huh? I was just joking." Keanu's gaze didn't waver. Respect isn't a joke. For a moment, no one spoke. Frank's shoulders tightened under his coveralls. He wanted to disappear. All his life, he'd handled insults quietly. But this was different. Someone was standing up for him, and that made the humiliation sting even more. He lowered his eyes to the floor, pretending to focus on the wrench in his hand. Maggie, the owner's daughter, watched from behind the service counter. Her long brown hair was tied back, and her sleeves were rolled up with grease marks from a morning of work. She was in her late 20s, sharp-eyed and steady-handed. She had grown up in this garage, helping her father run it after he fell ill. She knew Frank well. He was more than an employee, he was like family. When Keanu had walked in earlier, she'd recognized him immediately, but didn't say a word. Fame didn't mean much to her, not compared to kindness. And right now, watching him speak up for Frank, she saw more than a movie star, she saw a man with decency. Ryan crossed his arms, trying to reassert control. "You know, it's easy for you to talk about hard work, man. You're rich. You don't get it." Keanu nodded slowly. "You're right. I've been blessed. But that doesn't mean I forget who made the world work before I had anything." Ryan frowned. "What, you think guys like him matter more than us?" Keanu tilted his head slightly. "I think guys like him matter just as much as you do. Maybe more, if you measure value by effort." Frank swallowed hard, his throat burned with unspoken words. He wanted to tell Keanu to stop, not because he disagreed, but because he wasn't used to being defended. Decades of being overlooked had taught him that staying silent was easier than standing tall. But Maggie stepped closer, wiping her hands on a rag. "Ryan," she said softly, "maybe let him finish the repair instead of the argument." Ryan turned to her, surprised. "Excuse me?" She looked him in the eye. "You came here for service, not to perform." Ryan blinked, taken aback. He wasn't used to being talked to like that, especially not by a mechanic's daughter. "Perform?" he repeated, his tone dripping with disbelief. Maggie didn't back down. "That's what this is, isn't it? A performance. You want your friends to laugh, to feel above someone who's actually doing something useful. Maybe you should find a stage instead of a shop." A few customers in the waiting area shifted in their chairs. The tension was thick enough to feel in the air. One of Ryan's friends gave an awkward cough. The other quietly slipped his phone into his pocket, realizing maybe this wasn't the kind of moment worth filming anymore. Ryan forced a smirk, trying to recover his confidence. "You really think I care what some small-town mechanic thinks of me?" Keanu finally stepped forward, his calm presence filling the space between them. "You do?" he said quietly. "If you didn't, you wouldn't be talking so much." Ryan hesitated, caught between anger and embarrassment. His arrogance began to crack. "You don't know me," he muttered. "I don't need to," Keanu replied. "I can see the way you treat people." The words hit like a soft punch, not loud or aggressive, but heavy with truth. For a moment, the only sound came from a compressor hissing in the background. Frank stood still beside the open hood of Ryan's car, watching this unlikely scene unfold. He'd seen plenty of arguments in his years, but never one where someone fought for him. Maggie glanced at Keanu with gratitude. She saw how his tone never rose, how every word carried respect even when it challenged arrogance. There was strength in that kind of gentleness. Ryan tried to laugh it off. "Look, you don't have to get all righteous about this. I was just teasing. The guy's fine." Frank finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "It's all right, Mr. Reeves. I've been called worse." Keanu turned toward him, his expression softening. "You shouldn't have to get used to disrespect." Frank smiled faintly, a mix of humility and pain. "Comes with the job, I guess." Keanu shook his head. "No, It comes with people forgetting what real work looks like. Something in those words made Ryan's friends lower their eyes. They hadn't expected a lecture from a Hollywood actor, but they couldn't argue with it either. The truth of it lingered in the silence. Maggie's father, Mr. Miller, stepped out from his office, then a man in his late 60s, still recovering from a heart condition that kept him from working full-time. He looked around the room, confused by the quiet. "Everything all right here?" Maggie quickly nodded. "We're fine, Dad. Just a misunderstanding." Mr. Miller smiled weakly and went back inside. Ryan took a deep breath and finally muttered, "Whatever. Just finish the tune-up. We've wasted enough time." Frank gave a small nod and turned back to the car, the weight of humiliation still sitting heavy. But under it now was something else. A spark of pride. For the card buys. The first time in a long while, he didn't feel invisible. Frank leaned under the hood, his hands steady once more. The smell of oil and metal filled the air, familiar and grounding. Keanu stood nearby, quietly watching, giving him silent company instead of pity. That alone meant more than any apology ever could. Ryan crossed his arms, muttering something under his breath, but this time, no one laughed. His friends had lost the confidence to mock. They leaned against the wall awkwardly, their earlier bravado stripped away by the calm dignity in front of them. Maggie fetched a set of spark plugs from the shelf and handed them to Frank. "Here," she said gently. "These are the new ones for the Huxley car." He nodded in thanks. Their fingers brushed for a brief second, and she could feel the roughness of his hands, the kind of texture that came from years of work, not neglect. When she glanced up, she noticed a faint smile on Keanu's face. He saw what she saw. Integrity, written into skin and bone. Ryan fidgeted, pretending to check his phone. "So, what are you, some kind of expert in garages now?" he asked, his tone bitter but uncertain. Keanu met his gaze evenly. "No, I'm someone who believes that people deserve respect no matter what they do for a living." Ryan looked away, the edge in his tone fading. "Yeah, well, guess that's easy to say when you're famous." Keanu's answer came without hesitation. "It's harder to say when you actually mean it." That quiet statement silenced the room again. The whir of a nearby fan was the only sound. Even the light tapping of Frank's wrench seemed softer now. Maggie stepped forward, speaking gently but firmly. "Mr. Huxley, your car will be ready in about an hour. You can wait inside if you like, or you can leave it and pick it up later." Ryan opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it. For the first time, his eyes flickered with something other than arrogance. Shame, maybe. He looked at Frank, who continued working without a word. Keanu turned toward the door. "I'll step outside for a bit," he said quietly. "Sometimes a little air clears the noise." Maggie nodded, her eyes following him as he left. When the door closed, Ryan exhaled deeply. "Man," he muttered, shaking his head, "he really made me look bad." Maggie didn't hesitate. "No, you did that yourself." Frank tightened the final bolt, wiped his hands clean, and said softly, "Maybe that's what he wanted to make us all see something we forget too easily." Outside, Keanu stood by his motorcycle under the sunlight, his reflection caught in the chrome. Inside, the tone of the garage had changed. Respect, once missing, had quietly returned. The sound of the door closing behind Keanu still echoed faintly when Ryan suddenly frowned, studying him through the glass window. Something about the man's face, his quiet poise, his steady way of moving it tugged at Ryan's memory. Then, it hit him. His eyes widened slightly, and his smirk returned, though now it carried a hint of disbelief. "Wait a second," Ryan said, raising his voice so everyone in the garage could hear. "You're Keanu Reeves, aren't you?" Frank froze where he stood. Maggie looked up sharply, her wrench slipping slightly from her hand. The other customers turned, whispering. Keanu stopped halfway to his motorcycle and turned back, the faintest trace of a smile at the corner of his lips. He nodded once, unbothered. The reaction was instant. Ryan's friends started murmuring in shock, pulling out their phones, pretending not to record but doing it anyway. One of them whispered, No way that's really him. Another said, "What's he even doing in a dump like this?" Ryan's smirk widened, feeding on the attention. "Man, I knew it," he said, laughing lightly. "Didn't expect to see Hollywood royalty hanging around a place like this. What's the deal? You shooting a movie or something?" Keanu shook his head, his expression unchanged. No movie, just an oil change. The quiet confidence in his tone unsettled Ryan again, but he covered it with mock amusement. "So, tell me," he said, leaning against the counter, "why defend a guy like him?" He pointed toward Frank, who stood frozen beside the car, his hand gripping the wrench tightly. Maggie frowned. "Ryan, that's enough." But Ryan kept going. "I mean, come on. You could be anywhere, luxury hotels, private lounges, whatever, and you're here getting your hands dirty for some old guy in overalls? What's the point?" Keanu's eyes flicked toward Frank, then back to Ryan. He spoke softly, but his words carried across the room. "Because I've been helped by people like him my entire life." The laughter died instantly. The room went silent, the only sound the faint hum of a fan somewhere near the back wall. Ryan blinked. What does that even mean? Keanu didn't answer right away. He walked toward Frank, his steps measured and calm. He stopped beside the workbench, where a few tools were scattered. Picking up a wrench, he turned it in his hand, checking its weight as though it were something familiar. Frank stared, unsure what to do. "You don't have to." But Keanu was already crouched beside the car, tightening a loose bolt. His movements were steady, practiced, like someone who had done this before. The sight stunned everyone. Ryan scoffed, trying to sound amused again. "What, you know how to fix cars now?" Keanu looked up briefly. "I know how to help." Frank's chest tightened. He didn't know whether to stop him or thank him. For the first time in years, someone wasn't looking down on him. They were standing beside him. The room seemed to hold its breath as Keanu worked quietly beside Frank. His jacket sleeve brushed against the metal edge of the car, and a faint streak of grease marked the fabric. But he didn't care. He tightened another bolt, checked the pressure gauge, and then leaned back slightly to examine the alignment, his motions deliberate and respectful. Frank glanced at him, still unsure whether to speak. "You really don't have to do that," he said softly. "I can handle it." Keanu gave a small smile. "I know you can. I just wanted to remind everyone what dignity looks like when it's working." Those words hung heavy in the air. Even Maggie paused mid-step, holding her clipboard to her chest as she watched the moment unfold. The way Keanu spoke wasn't showy or loud. It was simple, grounded, and real. She could see that it wasn't an act. Ryan crossed his arms and rolled his eyes. "Oh, please," he said. "You think tightening a few bolts makes you some kind of saint? You're just trying to look good." Keanu stood up slowly, wiped his hands on a nearby rag, and looked Ryan straight in the eyes. "I don't need to look good," he said calmly. "I just want to do good." Ryan opened his mouth to reply but couldn't find the words. The arrogance in his face faltered, replaced by an uncomfortable quiet. Frank felt something shift inside him, a mix of pride and disbelief. In all his years, no one like this had ever defended him, much less stood shoulder to shoulder with him in a greasy garage. He could feel the heat behind his eyes but blinked it back, not wanting anyone to see. Maggie finally broke the silence. "Mr. Reeves," she said gently, "thank you, but really, you don't have to stay." Keanu looked at her with a faint smile. "Some things are worth staying for." He turned back toward Frank. "You remind me of a man I knew once, a janitor who helped me when no one else did. People laughed at him too. But he taught me that what you do doesn't define your worth. How you do it does." Frank's voice was low. "That's a rare thing to hear these days." Keanu nodded. "That's why I try to say it when I can." Ryan shifted his weight, uneasy. His friends looked at him, then at Keanu, clearly uncomfortable with how far things had gone. The power dynamic in the room had flipped completely. The man they mocked now stood taller, without saying a word, while the one who mocked him looked smaller by the minute. Frank went back to work, tightening the last nut with a slow, sure motion. Keanu handed him a wrench without being asked, as if he'd done it 100 times. For a few moments, they worked in silence, the two men moving in rhythm, one seasoned by decades of labor, the other guided by quiet respect. When they finished, Frank exhaled, his voice trembling. "You didn't have to prove anything for me." Keanu smiled faintly. "I wasn't proving anything. I was reminding them what real worth looks like." Ryan leaned against the counter, his earlier confidence gone. He looked at Keanu, then at Frank, and back again, struggling to find something clever to say. For once, the words didn't come. Keanu wiped his hands with a rag and placed the wrench gently back on the table. "You see that?" he said quietly. "That's what keeps the world moving. It's not the money, the titles, or the cars. It's the people who build and repair them." Ryan stared at the floor, pretending to check his watch. His friends avoided eye contact completely. Frank stood beside the car, still processing everything that had just happened. His heart felt heavy, but full. For years, he'd grown used to silence, to being overlooked. Now, in one afternoon, someone had not only seen him, but had also treated his work as something sacred. Maggie finally spoke. "Mr. Reeves," she said softly, "you didn't have to do that, but thank you. You just gave everyone here something to remember." Keanu nodded. People forget that respect doesn't cost anything. Frank looked at him, still trying to make sense of it all. "You really meant what you said earlier? That people like me helped you?" Keanu's voice softened. "Every day. My first motorcycle was held together by a man who worked 2 jobs and never asked for credit. When I was broke, a mechanic gave me a free tune-up because he said he saw something honest in my eyes. I never forgot that." Frank blinked back tears. "That's rare now." Keanu smiled. "Maybe, but it's not gone." For a moment, there was nothing but the hum of the ceiling fan and the faint squeak of Maggie's shoes as she shifted her weight. Everyone in the garage felt it, the weight of decency, quiet but undeniable. Keanu turned toward the group of young men. "The thing about hard work," he said, "is that you don't have to understand it to benefit from it, but you should respect it anyway." Ryan's face reddened. He gave a tight nod, the first real sign of humility. "Yeah," he muttered. "You're right." Keanu glanced at Frank one last time and gave him a small pat on the shoulder. "Keep doing what you do, Frank. You're keeping more than engines running. You're keeping people moving forward." Frank's voice cracked when he replied, "Thank you, Mr. Reeves." Keanu smiled warmly. "Call me Keanu." As he walked toward the sunlight streaming through the open garage door, the air seemed lighter. Behind him, the sound of wrenches, engines, and quiet reflection filled the space again, steady, honest, and alive. The noon sun filtered through the dusty glass windows of the garage, scattering light across the floor. The smell of motor oil had started to fade, replaced by the faint aroma of coffee and sandwiches. It was lunch hour. The morning's confrontation still lingered in the air, but the rush of customers had slowed, giving everyone a chance to breathe again. Frank sat on a small wooden bench near the side entrance, unwrapping his sandwich from a piece of wax paper. His hands were still trembling slightly. The laughter and mockery from earlier kept replaying in his mind, but so did Keanu's calm defense. The words, "If men like him stopped working, none of you would be driving," had carved themselves deep into his memory. Keanu approached quietly, holding a cup of black coffee and a small takeout bag. He motioned toward the spot beside Frank. "Mind if I sit?" Frank blinked, surprised. "Oh, sure, yeah, please." Maggie soon joined them, wiping her hands with a rag. She sat across from them at the small break table, setting down a half-empty thermos. The three sat together in a rare pocket of quiet, the only sounds being the ticking of a clock and the hum of the fan overhead. Frank kept his eyes on his sandwich, trying to think of something to say. "You didn't have to do what you did earlier," he said finally, "but I appreciate it." Keanu nodded. "Sometimes silence helps. Other times, silence keeps people small. You deserve to be seen." Frank gave a small, tired laugh. "Seen? I've spent most of my life covered in grease. Nobody wants to look at that." Keanu smiled faintly. Maybe they just forgot what real work looks like. Maggie looked up, her expression thoughtful. That's true, she said. Dad used to say the same thing. He said, when people stop appreciating the hands that build things, everything starts to fall apart. Frank nodded slowly. Your old man's right. I've seen it happen. Back in the day, every mechanic in town knew each other. We helped each other out. Now, it's all competition franchises, corporate shops, robots. People come in with fancy cars and look at us like we're dirt. Keanu took a sip of his coffee. That's because they confuse clean hands with clean hearts. Frank paused mid-bite, looking at him, caught off guard by the truth in that line. You've got away with words, he said quietly. But I guess you have to in your business. Keanu shook his head. Not words. Listening. That's what matters more. Frank leaned back, the corners of his mouth twitching into a faint smile. Listening, huh? Don't get much of that anymore either. Keanu smiled back. Then maybe we start now. Frank looked down at his hands, turning them slowly under the harsh garage light. They were calloused and rough, the lines deepened by decades of turning wrenches and lifting engines. The nails were permanently darkened, no matter how much he scrubbed. These hands built a life, he said quietly. But they also lost one. When my shop went under, it felt like losing family all over again. Mary Ann was gone, and then the business went next. After that, I didn't know who I was anymore. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his tone gentle. You didn't lose yourself, Frank. You just started over, somewhere smaller. There's a difference. Frank gave a dry chuckle. Doesn't feel that way when you're scraping by fixing carburetors for people who look at you like you're invisible. Maggie met his gaze, firm but kind. You're not invisible. You're the reason this place even stays open. Without you, Dad would have had to close years ago. Frank's eyes softened. He gave me a job when no one else would. I owe him for that. Keanu shook his head. No, you earned it. Frank looked up, the weight of Keanu's words settling into his chest. It had been years since anyone had spoken to him with that kind of sincerity. You really think people like me still matter? He asked. Keanu smiled faintly. More than ever. The world runs on people who don't need credit to do good work. Folks like you are the backbone of every place worth living in. Maggie nodded. He's right. You teach every kid who walks through that door something about patience, about pride, even if they don't say it. Frank exhaled, his shoulders easing. You two talk like you've got all the answers. Keanu smiled. Not answers, just perspective. Frank gave a small laugh, shaking his head. Perspective. Haven't heard that word in a while. He took the last bite of his sandwich, then leaned back, feeling lighter somehow. The three of them sat in easy silence. The garage was still warm from the morning sun, the faint hum of the vending machine filling the quiet. Maggie looked over at Keanu. You know, not many people would have done what you did this morning. I don't think those guys will forget it. Keanu finished his coffee and set the cup aside. Maybe that's the point. Sometimes the smallest moments are what change people the most. Frank looked between them and smiled for real this time. The first genuine smile all day. Guess lunch never tasted this good before. Keanu grinned back. It's not the food, Frank. It's the company. Outside, a warm breeze swept through the open garage door, carrying with it the faint sound of traffic. Inside, three people from completely different worlds sat together, sharing something simple and something true. By the next morning, Miller's garage was buzzing before the first customer even walked through the door. It wasn't the usual noise of tools or engines this time, it was whispers. Word had spread overnight that Keanu Reeves had been seen at the small-town shop defending a local mechanic. Someone had snapped a picture, just a quick one through the glass, of him standing beside Frank with a wrench in his hand. By sunrise, that photo was all over social media. The town's local Facebook page exploded. One comment read, Keanu Reeves at Miller's garage? You've got to be kidding. Another added, that's Frank Mallory in the photo. About time someone stood up for that man. Others doubted the story entirely until Maggie confirmed it quietly to a friend at the diner. Within an hour, every booth in town was talking about it. At the same time, national entertainment blogs started picking it up. A headline read, "Keanu Reeves defends working-class mechanic in small town. Fans say that's so Keanu." The image showed Keanu crouched beside the car, his jacket smeared with grease, while Frank looked on in disbelief. The photo captured something real human kindness in the middle of ordinary life. Frank didn't know any of this when he arrived that morning. He walked in carrying his lunchbox, thinking about the motorcycle engine he and Keanu had been tinkering with the night before. When Maggie showed him her phone with the article pulled up, he froze mid-step. "What in the world?" he murmured, blinking at the screen. She smiled. "It's gone viral, Frank. You're practically famous." Frank shook his head. "I didn't do anything." "Exactly," Maggie said. "That's why people love it." Keanu showed up not long after, dressed the same as before, simple jeans, jacket, and that quiet ease that made him seem more local than celebrity. When he heard about the news, he just smiled faintly and said, "Well, the internet moves fast." Frank looked embarrassed. "I hope this doesn't cause trouble for you." Keanu shook his head. "It's all right. People will talk. Let them." Meanwhile, somewhere across town, Ryan Huxley was scrolling through his phone at a downtown cafe. His friends had been messaging him non-stop. One text read, "Dude, that video of Keanu at the shop, it's everywhere." Another said, "We look like jerks." Man, maybe delete your posts before someone tags you. Ryan clenched his jaw, scrolling through the comments. The photo made him look exactly how he'd been mocking, shallow and small. He didn't reply to any of the messages. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, the gears turning in his mind. He'd find a way to fix this, to set the record straight, as he called it. But deep down, he wasn't sure if that meant apologizing or just saving face. By late afternoon, the story had reached beyond the town limits. Local news outlets started calling Miller's garage, asking if they could get a statement. Maggie had to unplug the shop phone after the fourth call. Frank stood near the counter, looking bewildered as reporters gathered outside, their cameras flashing through the window. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "It was just a small thing. Why are people making such a fuss?" Maggie smiled. "Because people are starved for decency, Frank. You and Keanu gave them a little piece of it." Keanu, who had been leaning against the wall sipping coffee, gave her a knowing look. "She's right. It's not about fame. It's about what people want to believe still exists." Frank sighed. "Respect?" "Exactly," Keanu said. They walked toward the back of the garage, where an old motorcycle sat under a tarp. It was a 1973 Norton Commando, one of the few bikes Frank had kept through all the hard years. Its chrome had dulled with time, but its shape still carried that beautiful defiance of old craftsmanship. Keanu's eyes lit up the moment he saw it. "You kept a Norton running this long?" he asked, crouching beside it. Frank grinned for the first time that day. "Barely. Needs a new carb, maybe a full rebuild. But she's got soul." Keanu brushed a hand across the seat. "She's got history." They spent the next few hours working on it together. The sound of tools, the click of sockets, and the occasional shared laugh filled the air. Frank had almost forgotten what it felt like to have company that didn't judge, someone who found beauty in the same simple things he did. Maggie occasionally brought them coffee or a sandwich, her heart swelling at the sight, two men from entirely different worlds, bound by the same quiet respect for honest work. As they worked, Keanu shared small pieces of his own story, how he'd always loved motorcycles, how he'd learned from a mechanic named Tony who treated engines like poetry. "He once told me," Keanu said, tightening a bolt, "every engine has a heartbeat. You just have to listen for it." Frank nodded. He was right. The two men exchanged a look that needed no words. Both understood that what they were doing wasn't just about fixing a machine, it was about restoring something deeper, something both of them had lost faith in at different points in their lives. When the sun began to dip low, painting the workshop in gold, the bike's engine finally coughed to life. It wasn't perfect, but it was breathing again. Frank smiled, his eyes moist. "I didn't think I'd ever hear that sound again." Keanu looked at the gleaming machine, the air vibrating with that old familiar rumble. Sometimes all it needs, he said softly, is someone who still believes it can run. The next morning, the garage parking lot was fuller than usual. People who had never stopped by before were suddenly lining up for oil changes, curious to meet the mechanic Keanu Reeves defended. Frank tried to keep his head down, fixing cars as always, pretending not to notice the phones pointed his way. But deep inside, he felt something warm, something he hadn't felt in years. Maggie managed the front desk, answering questions with patience. Yes, Mr. Reeves really was here. No, we didn't call the news. He just came in like anyone else. She smiled politely through every question, proud that her small-town shop had become a symbol of something good. Keanu, meanwhile, had stayed another night in a small motel off the highway. He'd intended to leave town after the repair, but when he heard how the moment had inspired people, he decided to stop by once more. He arrived that afternoon, parking his motorcycle quietly near the back. Frank looked up from under the hood of a pickup and grinned. Back for more trouble? Keanu smiled. Back for another cup of coffee. They stood together again near the same bench where they'd shared lunch the day before. The noise of the garage buzzed around them, but the two men spoke quietly, away from the cameras. Frank looked toward the small crowd outside. You think this'll all fade soon? Keanu nodded slowly. Probably. That's how the world works. But maybe, for a moment, people remembered something important. Frank chuckled. Like what? That good men still exist, Keanu said. Frank's smile faltered. He didn't see himself that way. He was just a man trying to make it through another day. But hearing those words from someone like Keanu gave them weight. You really think that's all it takes? Keanu shrugged. Sometimes a story is enough to remind people of what they forgot. Outside, Ryan's car pulled up across the street. He sat inside for a long moment, watching through the windshield. His friends weren't with him this time. He didn't come inside or say anything, just watched as Keanu handed Frank a wrench and the two went back to work on the old Norton. For the first time, Ryan didn't see a joke. He saw something he wanted to understand. As the afternoon sun poured through the garage doors, the two men continued side by side, tools in hand. The laughter from yesterday was gone, replaced by the steady, rhythmic sound of honest work. And somewhere between the hum of the engine and the quiet between words, a small town found a reason to believe in decency again. Evening settled slowly over Miller's garage, painting the metal tools and old car parts in shades of amber and rust. The workers had gone home, and the streets outside were quiet except for the low hum of distant traffic. Inside, the smell of oil and coffee lingered. Keanu stayed behind with Frank, helping him tidy up the shop after a long day. As they put the last of the tools back on the wall, Keanu noticed a small door slightly ajar near the back office. Through the narrow opening, he could see dim light spilling from inside. Mind if I step in? He asked. Frank hesitated for a second, then nodded. Go ahead. Not much to see in there. Keanu pushed the door open gently. The small office looked like it hadn't changed in decades. A single desk sat under an old lamp, its shade cracked with age. Papers were neatly stacked, and the faint tick of a clock filled the room. On the wall hung framed photos, some black and white, others faded with time. One photo caught Keanu's eye immediately. It showed two young men standing beside a tank, both wearing military fatigues, smiling proudly. Their faces were smudged with dirt, but their eyes were bright. Keanu stepped closer and studied it. That's you, he said quietly. Frank looked up from the doorway, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he nodded. Yeah, Vietnam. That was 1969. Keanu turned back toward him. You were in the war? Frank walked into the room slowly, his steps heavy with memory. I was 22. Didn't know much about the world back then. Just wanted to do right by my country. He paused, his eyes fixed on the photo. The other guy there, his name was Eddie Collins. Best friend I ever had. Keanu looked back at the picture. You two look close. Frank smiled faintly. We looked out for each other. He was from Kentucky, always talking about the farm he'd go back to. Said he wanted to build tractors one day, fix things instead of breaking them. His smile faded. He didn't make it home. The room grew quiet. The ticking clock seemed louder now. Keanu waited a moment, giving Frank space. Frank's voice came softer, more distant. It happened in the Delta. We were ambushed. He pushed me out of the way before the blast hit. I was lucky. He wasn't. Keanu lowered his gaze, his expression heavy with empathy. I'm sorry. Frank nodded slowly, the pain still etched into his voice. After I got home, I went to see his mother. She asked me to promise her one thing, that I'd spend my life helping others, because Eddie never got the chance to. I said I would. Frank sat down at the old desk, his fingers tracing the edge of the picture frame as if it were a relic. His voice trembled slightly when he spoke again. I didn't know what that promise meant at first. I came back from the war lost, angry, confused. I didn't talk much. I just fixed things, trailers, lawnmowers, whatever people brought by. I guess it was my way of keeping my head quiet. Keanu leaned against the doorframe, listening closely. There was no pity in his eyes, only understanding. And then cars came along? Frank nodded. Cars gave me something steady to hold on to. They made sense. You fix what's broken, and it runs again. There's a peace in that. The world's messy, but an engine, it's honest. He chuckled softly, his eyes distant. I used to tell my wife the same thing. Mary Ann used to tease me, said I loved carburetors more than her. Keanu smiled faintly. I doubt that. Frank's eyes softened. No, you're right. She was the one who helped me keep that promise. Every time someone came to the shop short on cash, she'd say, "Fix the car, Frank. They've got kids to feed." So I did. For 50 years, I've been fixing cars I never got paid for. Keanu shook his head slightly in admiration. You've done more good than you realize. Frank exhaled, his gaze still fixed on the photo. I don't know. Some nights, I wonder if it was enough. Eddie was the kind of man who would have built something great. Me, I just kept other people moving. Keanu walked closer and knelt beside the desk, meeting his eyes. That's what greatness looks like, Frank. Keeping people moving. You may not see it, but you've been building something every day, something invisible, but lasting. Frank blinked hard, his throat tightening. No one's ever said that to me. Keanu gave a quiet smile. Maybe no one looked close enough. The air between them was heavy but warm. For a moment, neither man spoke. The hum of the old fluorescent light flickered overhead. Frank finally stood and reached for another picture frame on the shelf. It showed him standing beside a young woman and a small child near a 70-second sedan. That's Lisa, he said. My daughter. She doesn't know half of what I've done, and I like it that way. She's got her own world to worry about. Keanu looked at the photograph, noticing the proud, tired smile on Frank's younger face. She'd be proud if she knew. Frank smiled sadly. Maybe. But I never wanted her to carry my ghosts. I just wanted her to live easy. Keanu nodded, his voice soft. Sometimes we forget that carrying ghosts is what keeps us human. Frank's eyes glistened, and for a moment, his hands trembled. The old soldier had carried decades of silence, but now, in the stillness of that small office, it felt like he'd finally set some of it down. The silence in the small office stretched, filled only by the hum of the lamp and the faint tick of the wall clock. Keanu stood quietly beside Frank, looking at the faded photograph again. The young man in uniform seemed so different from the quiet mechanic before him, and yet Keanu could still see the same fire in his eyes, dimmed but not gone. Frank spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. You know, after the war, people didn't want to hear about Vietnam anymore. We came back and just disappeared into the noise. I never talked about it, not even to my daughter. Folks see an old mechanic, but they don't see the parts of life I left overseas. Keanu nodded slowly. They see the surface, not the story underneath. Frank looked at him, studying his face. You get that, don't you? People think they know you, but they only see the movie star, not the man. Keanu smiled faintly. Yeah, I get it. Everyone wears a version of themselves for the world, but the real person stays quiet, hidden. Frank chuckled softly. Guess that's both of us then hiding in plain sight. Keanu's gaze drifted back to the photo. You kept your promise to Eddie's mother, Frank. Every time you fixed a car for someone who couldn't afford it, every time you stayed late to help a stranger, you were living that promise. You honored him through every act of kindness you didn't talk about. Frank swallowed hard. You really think that counts for something? Keanu looked directly at him. It counts for everything. Frank's eyes filled, and for a long moment, he couldn't speak. The years of work, loss, and quiet sacrifice seemed to settle in the space between them, heavy, but no longer lonely. He finally managed a shaky smile. You know, I think Eddie would have liked you. Keanu's smile deepened. Then that's the best compliment I could ever get. They stood side by side in silence, two men bound by different lives, but the same kind of heart. Outside, the evening light faded to blue. The hum of passing cars drifted through the cracked window, carrying the smell of gasoline and summer air. Frank placed the photograph back on the wall. I used to think that promise kept me chained to the past, he said. But maybe it's what's been keeping me alive. Keanu nodded slowly. Sometimes the things we promise to others end up saving us, too. Frank gave a quiet laugh. Guess you're right. You usually are. For the first time in years, Frank Mallory didn't feel like a man forgotten by time. He felt seen, understood, and finally, free. The morning began quietly, with the usual hum of work filling the garage. Frank was under a hood, humming an old tune, while Maggie handled customers at the counter. The chaos of the viral story had started to settle. Frank was beginning to think maybe things would return to normal. But peace doesn't last long in a world obsessed with attention. Just after 10, the sound of a high-end SUV rolled into the parking lot. The engine purred too perfectly, the kind that belonged to people who never lifted a wrench. Frank straightened and wiped his hands on his rag. Maggie peeked out the window and frowned. Ryan Huxley stepped out, wearing designer sunglasses and a crisp white shirt, followed by two men holding cameras and a microphone. Behind them came a van plastered with his company logo, Huxley Motors Lifestyle. He waved broadly as if arriving at a press event. Frank's stomach sank. What's he doing back here? Maggie crossed her arms. Trying to look good again. Ryan walked straight to Frank, flashing a big smile. Frank, my man, I came to make things right. Thought I'd donate something to the shop. Frank blinked in confusion. Donate? Ryan turned to his camera crew. You're rolling? Good. All right, everybody. We're here at Miller's Garage, where a few days ago I might have gotten a little carried away. He chuckled dramatically. But hey, we're all human, right? Frank looked uncomfortable as the camera zoomed in on him. Ryan motioned toward the van, and one of his crew members opened the back door to reveal 4 luxury tires. These beauties, Ryan announced, are top-of-the-line performance tires. I figured I'd help this old shop get an upgrade. Keep the spirit of hard work alive, you know? The very do. Cameraman laughed lightly, trying to hype the moment. Frank stared at the tires, unsure what to say. It didn't feel like an apology. It felt like a stunt. Keanu, who had been at the back of the shop cleaning up tools, turned at the sound of laughter. He walked forward slowly, eyes narrowing as he saw the scene unfold. Ryan continued, and let's be honest, this place could use a facelift. Maybe we'll start a GoFundMe or something. Help the old guy retire gracefully. The words landed like a slap. The crew chuckled quietly behind the cameras, but the laughter died when Keanu's voice cut through the noise. You're not helping, he said firmly. Ryan turned, startled. Hey, Keanu, you're still around. Perfect. This'll look great with you in the shot. Keanu stepped closer, his expression steady but hard. You're not fixing anything here. You're humiliating him again. Ryan laughed awkwardly, still facing the camera. Relax, man. It's just content. We're spreading positivity. Keanu's tone dropped lower, sharper. Some things shouldn't be content. The garage went completely still. The sound of the air compressor cut off, and even the traffic outside seemed to pause. Ryan looked around, realizing the moment was no longer his to control. The cameras kept rolling, but the smiles on his crew's faces had vanished. Keanu took another step forward, closing the distance between them. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the steel in it. Do you even hear yourself, Ryan? You're calling this an apology, but you're turning it into a show. Ryan tried to laugh it off. Come on, man. It's good PR for everyone. A little redemption arc, right? You get your feel-good moment, he gets a donation, and I get to fix my reputation. Win-win. Keanu didn't blink. It's not a win when you make someone a prop in their own story. Frank stood frozen, his eyes on the floor. The humiliation crept up his spine. He didn't want to be filmed. He didn't want his life turned into entertainment. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Maggie stepped forward, her voice trembling but fierce. You need to leave, Mr. Huxley. This isn't your stage. Ryan scoffed. Look, I get it. You people don't understand how media works. This kind of stuff helps. It brings attention to local businesses. Everyone loves a redemption story. Keanu shook his head slowly. You're not here to help, Ryan. You're here to rewrite what you did, so you don't have to feel bad about it. But you can't fix cruelty with a camera. Ryan's smirk faltered. You think you know me? Keanu's voice was low, measured. I know what it looks like when someone uses another man's pain for clicks. For a moment, no one moved. The weight of those words hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. Even the cameraman lowered his lens a little. Ryan looked around, his forced grin fading. Fine, he muttered. If you want to make me the bad guy again, go ahead. The internet loves that. Keanu didn't respond right away. He turned toward Frank and spoke quietly but clearly. You don't need his charity, Frank. You've already earned more respect than he'll ever buy. Frank looked up, his eyes glassy. He finally found his voice. Keanu's right. I don't need gifts or GoFundMes. I just need to work. That's all I've ever wanted. The words were simple, but they hit like truth. Maggie stepped beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. And that's what this place stands for. Honest work, not spectacle. Keanu faced the camera crew. Turn those off. One of the cameramen hesitated. Mr. Reeves, we're just following orders. Keanu met his gaze. Then follow better ones. The man blinked, then lowered the camera completely. The other followed suit. Silence filled the garage again, heavy and cleansing. Ryan stood there, suddenly, stripped of his audience. Without the camera, he looked smaller, his designer shirt out of place among the oil stains and workbenches. You don't get it, he said weakly. I was trying to do something good. Keanu's voice softened now. Then try again. But next time, do it when no one's watching. Ryan swallowed hard, his confidence crumbling. He turned to leave, muttering something under his breath. The crew followed, their expensive shoes squeaking across the concrete. When the last of them were gone, the garage exhaled. Frank leaned against the workbench, wiping his hands on his rag. Guess I should have known he'd come back. Maggie shook her head. He came to fix his image, not his heart. Keanu picked up a wrench and set it gently on the table. Let him learn the hard way. Some lessons only sink in when the world stops clapping. Frank nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. But you know what? I think he'll remember this one. Keanu smiled faintly, glancing toward the open garage door where sunlight streamed in. So will everyone else. The garage was still thick with tension after Ryan and his crew left. The dust from their van tires hadn't even settled outside when Keanu quietly turned back to Frank. Without saying a word, he reached for the same wrench he had used days earlier. He gave it a small twirl in his hand, and then crouched beside the open hood of a faded blue pickup truck sitting in the corner. Frank blinked, surprised. You really don't have to, Keanu. You've already done more than enough. Keanu looked up at him with a faint smile. You said it yourself, Frank. You just need to work. So, let's work. Frank hesitated, his hands trembling slightly, still shaken from the public humiliation Ryan had tried to stage. For years, those hands had built engines, replaced parts, and rebuilt lives in quiet ways. Now, they trembled not from age, but from emotion. But when Keanu handed him the wrench, their fingers touched, and something steady returned. Together, they leaned under the hood. Maggie stood nearby, watching them, her heart full. She didn't dare interrupt. What was happening before her eyes wasn't just two men fixing a car. It was dignity being rebuilt, piece by piece. The customers who had lingered outside slowly peeked in again. Some had seen Ryan's failed stunt livestream before his crew cut the feed. The footage was short, but the part that stayed online was the image of Keanu standing his ground for Frank. It spread across social media faster than Ryan's rehearsed apology ever could. Within hours, clips of Keanu and Frank working together began trending online under the tag number "Grease is Gold." People from every corner of the internet started commenting, "Respect the man who keeps you moving. Heroes don't wear suits, they wear overalls. This is what real class looks like." Inside the garage, Frank didn't know any of this yet. He was too focused on the bolts and the hum of the engine. For the first time in a long time, his hands didn't shake. Every twist of the wrench felt purposeful, every movement steady. It wasn't just metal he was tightening, it was something inside himself. Keanu wiped the sweat from his brow and gave a satisfied nod. "Fuel line's a little clogged," he said. "Mind if I take a look at the carburetor?" Frank chuckled. "You know, for a movie star, you're not half bad with tools." Keanu laughed quietly. "I learned from good people." Maggie bit her lip, holding back tears. She had never seen Frank smile like this. He looked younger, lighter, as if the weight of years had suddenly lifted. And Keanu, kneeling beside him in worn jeans and dusty boots, didn't look like a celebrity anymore. He looked like one of them. The air inside the garage changed. It wasn't tense anymore, it was alive. The rhythmic clink of metal against metal echoed like a heartbeat. Frank tightened a bolt while Keanu held the flashlight steady. They worked with quiet precision, two men who didn't need words to communicate. Every small gesture carried meaning. Every turn of the wrench carried respect. Outside, a few customers had started filming from a distance again. But this time, it wasn't mockery. It was admiration. The camera phones captured Keanu wiping his hands on a rag, laughing with Frank as they tested the engine. And when the truck finally roared to life, a cheer rose from the small crowd that had gathered outside. Maggie covered her mouth, her eyes shining. "You did it," she said softly. Frank smiled, wiping a streak of oil from his cheek. "We did it." Keanu nodded. "Nothing broken that can't be fixed." Frank stood for a moment, staring at the truck, the smoke curling from its exhaust. His heart felt strange, as if something inside him had been repaired right along with the machine. He looked down at his hands. They were still rough, still scarred, but steady now. "Feels good," he murmured. "It's been a long time since a job felt this good." Keanu leaned against the truck, his gaze steady and kind. "That's because you're not just fixing cars, Frank. You're fixing people's faith, one honest turn at a time." Frank chuckled, shaking his head. "Faith, huh? I think you've got me confused with a preacher." Keanu smiled. "You've been preaching your whole life, just with grease and grit instead of words." The sound of an approaching motorcycle broke the quiet moment. Someone nearby whispered, "It's him. It's really Keanu Reeves." But neither man looked up. They just kept working, tuning the idle, making sure the engine purred like it was meant to. Meanwhile, online, the video had gone viral again. Viewers shared the clip of Keanu kneeling beside Frank, captioning it with messages like, "Real heroes don't need headlines, and dignity doesn't need a filter." Within hours, the world began to talk not about Ryan's arrogance, but about the quiet grace of a mechanic who refused to bow his head. Maggie showed Frank her phone, scrolling through the endless stream of positive comments. He squinted at the screen, overwhelmed. "All this over fixing a truck?" She smiled warmly. "No, Frank. Over what it means." He blinked, unsure how to respond. He had lived decades in silence, unnoticed by the world, and now strangers from across the country were writing messages of gratitude and respect. "Never thought anyone would thank me for doing my job," he said softly. Keanu rested a hand on his shoulder. "The best people never do." For a while, no one said anything more. They just stood there, listening to the steady hum of the engine and the chatter of voices outside. The light from the open garage door stretched across the floor, turning the grease stains into gold under the Sunday. Finally, Maggie broke the silence. "You know, I think that truck sounds better than it did when it was new." Frank smiled. Maybe it just needed a little faith, too. Keanu laughed, quietly. Seems like everything around here did. Frank looked at him, the gratitude plain on his face. You could have walked away, Keanu, but you didn't. You stayed. Keanu met his gaze with humility. Some people fix cars, some fix hearts. I guess today, we did both. As the crowd outside applauded and the sun dipped lower, the two men shook hands, oil-stained palms meeting in silent understanding. For Frank, it wasn't fame that mattered, it was being seen. And in that moment, under the hum of a steady engine, he finally was. 2 days later, the internet turned its full attention toward Ryan Huxley. What he thought would be a career-saving video had exploded in the worst way possible. The short clip of him trying to donate tires to Miller's garage had spread across social media, but not for the reasons he hoped. Viewers called it manipulative, staged, and cruel. The comments were relentless. One headline read, "Influencer humiliates working-class mechanic Keanu Reeves steps in to stop him." Another said, "When kindness meets arrogance, kindness wins." Ryan sat in his sleek downtown office, his phone lighting up with notifications. Sponsors began calling, one after another, each distancing themselves from the controversy. "We can't be associated with this," one marketing manager told him bluntly. "Your brand's become toxic." He tried to argue, but deep down he knew the truth. His attempt to control the story had spun completely out of his hands. The video of Keanu quietly helping Frank fix the truck had replaced his own. It was the clip the world wanted to see. His arrogance had gone viral, and Keanu's humility had buried it. Meanwhile, at Miller's garage, reporters had begun arriving in small waves. Cars lined the curb, microphones and cameras flashing as journalists tried to get statements from anyone willing to talk. Maggie stood at the counter, politely turning most of them away. Frank stayed in the back, pretending to work, though his hands shook slightly every time a reporter shouted his name. When one finally slipped through the door, Frank straightened up, startled. "Mr. Mallory," the woman said kindly, "just one question. How did it feel when Keanu Reeves stood up for you?" Frank hesitated, his voice uncertain. "I'm no one special. I just fix cars." The reporter smiled gently. "That's exactly why people care." Frank thought for a long moment, glancing down at his hands. "He treated me like a man," he finally said. "Not a machine. That's all there is to it." Those words spread quickly. The next morning, newspapers across the country printed them as headlines. "He treated me like a man, not a machine." The simplicity of it touched people deeply. Back at the shop, Maggie watched the coverage online and felt an odd mix of pride and disbelief. Frank had become a symbol of dignity without even trying. Customers began arriving not just for repairs but to shake his hand, to thank him for reminding them of something important. Keanu, meanwhile, stayed out of sight. He ignored every interview request, every talk show invitation, every offer to tell his side. He had no interest in fame. To him, the story wasn't about him at all. It was about the man who showed up every day, rain or shine, and worked quietly, without complaint. That morning, before the reporters arrived, he stopped by the garage one last time. Maggie found him standing near the counter, writing something on a small piece of paper. When he noticed her, he smiled softly. "I didn't want to make a scene, so I'll just leave this for you and Frank." Maggie looked down at the folded card he handed her, its edges slightly smudged with oil from his fingers. She hesitated before opening it, sensing the weight of whatever he had written. Inside, in Keanu's steady handwriting, were the words, "Some people fix cars. Some fix people's faith. You did both today." Her eyes softened as she read it aloud quietly. Frank had just stepped out from the garage bay, wiping his hands on a rag. "What's that?" he asked. She smiled faintly, holding it out for him. "Something for you." Frank took the note carefully, as if it were fragile. He read it once, then again, his lips pressing together. He didn't say anything for a moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and steady. "You know, I've worked my whole life with machines, but I never thought anything I did could fix people." Keanu smiled. "You did more than you realize, Frank." People saw what dignity looks like again. That's rare. Frank nodded slowly, emotion flickering behind his tired eyes. Guess I'll have to keep working then. You'd better, Keanu said, smiling. You've still got plenty left to teach. For a long moment, they stood there in comfortable silence. The faint sound of a wrench clinking onto a tool tray filled the gap between words. Maggie wanted to say something meaningful, something worthy of the moment, but she found herself too choked up to speak. Frank finally extended his hand. You didn't have to do any of this, Keanu, but you did. You reminded me of who I was before the world stopped caring. Keanu shook his hand firmly. The world never stopped caring, Frank. It just needed someone like you to remind it why it should. With that, Keanu turned toward the open garage door. The light outside was soft, the kind that comes before dusk, spilling golden rays across the concrete floor. He walked to his motorcycle parked nearby, the same one they had worked on together earlier in the week. As he swung his leg over it, Frank called out one last time, "Keanu." He turned, smiling. "Thanks for treating me like more than a headline." Keanu nodded. Thanks for proving headlines can still have heart. The engine rumbled to life, low and even. He waved once, then rode off down the dusty road, his figure growing smaller, in the fading light until it disappeared beyond the row of trees. Inside, Maggie watched the sunlight fade from the shop walls. Frank stood quietly for a long time, the note still in his hand. He finally slipped it into the top drawer of his old toolbox, next to a photograph of his wife and daughter. When Maggie asked why he put it there, he smiled softly. Because every time I open this drawer, I want to remember that sometimes, even when life rusts you out, someone can still make you shine again. That evening, as the garage lights flickered off, Frank looked out through the open doors at the setting sun and whispered to himself, he fixed more than cars this week. And for the first time in years, he believed it. 3 quiet weeks passed after Keanu's visit. The shop slowly returned to its old rhythm engines humming, radios playing low country songs, and Frank's steady hands back at work under the hood. The viral attention had faded, but the feeling it left behind hadn't. Every so often, a stranger stopped by just to shake Frank's hand, thanking him for reminding the world that dignity still existed in hard work. Frank always smiled politely, though he didn't know what to say. Deep down, he was just grateful life had found its way back to normal. It was a Thursday morning when the phone rang at the counter. Maggie answered, her voice cheerful as usual. "Miller's Garage, how can I help you?" There was a pause, followed by a calm, professional voice on the other end. "Good morning. I'm calling from the Keanu Reeves Foundation for Technical Education. May I speak with Mr. Frank Mallory?" Maggie blinked. "The Keanu Reeves Foundation?" "Yes, ma'am," the woman said warmly. "Mr. Reeves asked us to reach out personally." Maggie's eyebrows lifted as she handed the phone toward the back. "Frank, you might want to take this one." Frank wiped his hands on a rag and picked up the receiver, confused. "This is Frank." "Mr. Mallory," the woman said. "My name is Claire Daniels. I'm a coordinator with the Keanu Reeves Foundation for Technical Education. Mr. Reeves spoke very highly of you. He asked me to invite you to join our new training center in Pasadena." Frank hesitated. "Training center?" "Yes. We're opening a facility that focuses on craftsmanship, real hands-on work. Mechanics, welding, fabrication, woodworking, even restoration. Mr. Reeves believes the best people to teach those skills are the ones who live them." Frank gripped the phone tighter, unsure how to respond. "Ma'am, I think you've got the wrong guy. I'm no teacher." Claire chuckled gently. "Mr. Reeves said you'd say that. He told me to." "Tell you this, age is what makes you a teacher." Frank went silent, the words sinking deep. He could almost hear Keanu's voice behind them, calm, patient, certain. Claire continued, "We'd like you to come on board as a senior instructor. The job would involve mentoring younger mechanics, showing them how to rebuild engines, how to take pride in precision. You'd have your own workspace, full benefits, travel covered. We'd even help you relocate if you wanted." Frank swallowed hard. That's a lot. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll think about it," Claire said kindly. Mr. Reeves believed this center wouldn't be complete without someone like you. We're opening next month. There's no pressure, but we'd be honored to have you. Frank sat down heavily on the stool behind the counter. He looked at his old toolbox in the corner, the same one he'd used since the 70s, the one where he'd tucked Keanu's note. He ran a hand over his jaw, unsure if he was dreaming. "I'll think about it," he said softly. "Good," Claire replied. "We'll send you all the details in an email today. Thank you, Mr. Mallory. And thank you for reminding people what real craftsmanship means." When the call ended, Frank sat quietly for a long time, the phone still resting in his hand. The idea of Pasadena felt too big, too far, too new. He'd spent most of his life right here in this small town, fixing the same kind of cars, seeing the same kind of faces. The thought of walking into a classroom full of students looking to him for guidance felt almost absurd. Maggie leaned on the counter, studying his expression. "Well?" she asked gently. He looked up, his voice a mix of disbelief and hesitation. "They want me to teach. In California." Her eyes widened. "That's incredible, Frank." "You've earned it," Frank chuckled under his breath. "Earned it? I'm a 68-year-old mechanic with a bad back, and more rust in my knees than these trucks have in their fenders." Maggie smiled. "That's exactly why they want you. You've lived it. You've got stories to tell, lessons that don't come from manuals." Frank stared at the floor, feeling the weight of her words. He thought about all the young faces that had come through the garage over the years, kids who quit after a week because the work was too hard, too dirty. Maybe if someone had taught them that grease wasn't failure but honor, they might have stayed. That night, Frank sat in his small living room, surrounded by old photographs. The one of Marianne sat on the table beside him, her smile soft and eternal. He picked it up, running his thumb along the frame. "What do you think, Marianne?" he whispered. "Would you laugh at the idea of me teaching?" In his mind, he could almost hear her voice again, teasing but warm. "You've been teaching all your life, Frank. You just didn't call it that." He smiled faintly, setting the picture down. Maybe she was right. The next morning, Frank arrived at the shop early. The sunrise painted long streaks of orange across the floor, and for a moment, everything felt suspended. Quiet. Hopeful. He walked to his toolbox and opened the top drawer. The note Keanu had left sat neatly inside, folded just the way he'd left it. He read it again. "Some people fix cars. Some fix people's faith. You did both today." He stood there for a long moment, then closed the drawer with quiet resolve. Maggie arrived just as he was wiping down the counter. "You look different," she said. Frank smiled. "Maybe I just decided something." "About Pasadena?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah." "I think I'm going," Maggie beamed. "They're lucky to have you, Frank." He shook his head slowly. "No, Maggie. I'm the lucky one." Later that day, he sent a short email to Claire confirming his decision. The reply came within an hour. Warm, grateful, and full of details about his upcoming flight and accommodations. For the first time in years, Frank Mallory felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't felt since his younger days in the Army, a purpose, a chance to pass the torch. And somewhere in Pasadena, Keanu Reeves smiled quietly when he got the message. Frank Mallory has accepted. The morning sun rose over Pasadena, spilling soft gold across the glass walls of the new Keanu Reeves Foundation Training Center for Technical Education. The building gleamed with a quiet pride, a mix of modern architecture and industrial warmth, steel beams, open floors, and rows of neatly arranged workstations. The air smelled faintly of machine oil and fresh paint. When Frank stepped through the doors, he stopped just inside the lobby, taking it all in. He'd seen pictures in the brochure Claire had sent, but nothing compared to standing there in person. The place was alive with energy students laughing, tools clinking, engines being tested in the distance. Everything gleamed like it had just been built, and in a way, it had just like this new chapter of his life. Claire appeared with her usual warm smile. "Mr. Mallory," she said, You made it. Welcome to Pasadena." Frank adjusted his cap nervously. "It's bigger than I imagined." She laughed. "It's not just a training center, it's a community. And a lot of that started with your story." Frank raised an eyebrow. "My story?" Claire nodded toward a mural stretching across the far wall. Painted in sweeping shades of gray and bronze were images of workers, mechanics, welders, builders, all intertwined in a beautiful composition. At the center of the mural were the words, "Every tool tells a story." Frank stared at it, his throat tightening. "That's something I used to tell my apprentices," he said softly. "Every scratch, every dent, it means something." Claire smiled. Mr. Reeves remembered. He said it should be the motto of the entire foundation. Frank swallowed hard, his chest heavy with emotion. They walked further into the main workshop area. Rows of spotless benches stood ready, each equipped with brand new sets of wrenches, gauges, and diagnostic tools. But what caught Frank's eye most was the sign above one of the larger bays. The letters were bold, metallic, and perfectly polished. The Mallory Mechanics Bay. Frank froze. "You've got to be kidding," he whispered. Claire grinned. "No joke." "Mister?" Reeves insisted on it. He said your name should hang where real work begins. For a long moment, Frank couldn't speak. His eyes watered as he looked at his name shining above the workshop. Decades of labor, years of being overlooked, all distilled into this one impossible moment of recognition. He rubbed the back of his neck, trying to keep his composure. "That man's gone and done too much," he muttered. Claire smiled. "He said you'd say that too." Just then, the sound of familiar footsteps echoed behind them. Frank turned, and there was Keanu, wearing a black jacket and that same easy smile. "You ready to build something bigger, Frank?" Frank blinked hard, trying not to tear up. "You mean this isn't big enough already?" Keanu laughed softly and clapped a hand on his shoulder. "It's just the beginning." Frank followed Keanu deeper into the workshop area, where the sound of chatter and laughter grew louder. A group of young men and women, no older than 25, stood around a dismantled engine block. Their coveralls were spotless, their eyes bright with curiosity. When they saw Keanu, they straightened, murmuring with excitement, but he motioned for them to relax. "This," Keanu said, gesturing toward Frank, "is the man I told you about. The one who reminded me that hard work is worth more than fame. He's your new senior instructor." Frank's breath caught. 12 pairs of eyes turned toward him, each face expectant. He felt suddenly small in his grease-stained jacket, a man built for back rooms and garages, not for classrooms filled with youth and promise. For a moment, he almost stepped back. But then he saw the mural again, the one with the words, "Every tool tells a story," and something inside him steadied. Keanu gave him an encouraging nod. "They're all yours." Frank approached the students slowly. The smell of metal and machine oil calmed him, grounding him like it always had. He rested a hand on the old engine block and said simply, "All right, first lesson. You're not here to fix machines. You're here to understand them." The room fell quiet. Frank continued, his voice steadying as he spoke. "An engine isn't just parts and pistons. It's rhythm, timing, patience. It talks to you if you know how to listen. You rush it, you break it. You respect it, it'll serve you for life." A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "My dad used to say that about tractors." Frank smiled. "Then your dad knew his stuff." The students laughed softly, the tension easing. Frank leaned forward, picking up a wrench from the table. "You see this tool? Everyone thinks it's simple. But this," he said, holding it up, "is trust. You drop it too often, you lose precision. You mistreat it, it won't perform right. That's how life works too. Respect your tools. Respect your craft. Respect yourself." The students nodded, listening intently. Keanu stood near the back, arms crossed, watching with quiet pride. He didn't need to say anything. The way Frank commanded the room with honesty, humility, and heart was more powerful than any speech he could give. Frank motioned for one of the students to step forward. "All right, let's get our hands dirty." Who wants to help me bring this engine back to life? A tall boy hesitated before stepping up. Frank handed him the wrench. Don't be afraid of it, he said kindly. Fear's what keeps people from learning. Every mistake teaches you something. Together, they began working through the bolts, the students crowding closer to watch. The sound of turning metal filled the air, joined by bursts of laughter and the occasional question shouted across the room. It felt alive like a heartbeat. When the session ended, the students applauded. Frank smiled awkwardly, wiping his hands. All right, don't clap yet. We've got a long way to go before you're mechanics. But if you can walk out of here knowing that your work matters, that's a start. One of the students, a young man with oil on his cheek, grinned. Mr. Mallory, do you really think we can be as good as you someday? Frank chuckled. Better. That's the point. Keanu stepped forward then, shaking Frank's hand firmly. Welcome home, he said quietly. Frank looked around the bright, bustling workshop. His name gleamed on the wall, the mural stretched across the ceiling, and 12 eager faces were waiting to learn. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the last of a dying breed. He felt like the beginning of something new. The months that followed were unkind to Ryan Huxley. The headlines faded, but the stain on his reputation didn't. Sponsors cut ties, brand deals vanished, and the investors who once begged to partner with him stopped returning calls. The world that had once adored him for his confidence now mocked him for his arrogance. Online, his name became a punchline, a cautionary tale of what happens when ego goes viral. At first, he tried to fight back. He posted long apologies on social media, but no one believed them. He launched new projects, hoping to bury the past, but each one failed before it began. Slowly, Ryan disappeared from the spotlight, his luxury lifestyle shrinking as his accounts drained. The penthouse went first, then the cars, then the assistants who had once catered to every whim. What remained was a man who finally had time to think and no one to impress. One late evening, under a bruised purple sky, Ryan drove alone down a quiet stretch of highway just outside Los Angeles. He was behind the wheel of his last remaining car, an old sports coupe he'd refused to sell. The road was empty, except for the steady rhythm of his tires against the asphalt. He wasn't sure where he was heading, maybe nowhere. Then, without warning, the engine sputtered. A warning light blinked on the dashboard, followed by a violent hiss from under the hood. Ryan pulled over, cursing under his breath as smoke began to rise. He popped the hood and stared helplessly at the mess inside. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who once mocked a mechanic was now stranded because he couldn't fix his own car. He pulled out his phone, but there was no signal, no roadside service, just the fading sound of crickets and the hum of distant traffic. He leaned against the car, rubbing his face in frustration, until headlights appeared on the horizon. A white pickup truck slowed beside him, its tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. The door opened, and out stepped a figure Ryan hadn't seen in months older, calmer, wearing a work shirt with his name stitched above the pocket. Need a hand? Frank Mallory asked. Ryan froze. You've got to be kidding. Frank smiled faintly. Life's funny that way. Ryan looked down, ashamed. What are you doing out here? Helping my students with night shifts, Frank said, motioning to the small repair trailer hitched to the back of the truck. We do volunteer roadside assistance for practice. You got lucky. Ryan laughed bitterly. Lucky isn't the word I'd use. Frank approached the car, peering under the hood. Pop it all the way, he said. Ryan hesitated. You're still willing to help me? Frank gave him a small, patient smile. Everyone deserves a tune-up, even people. Ryan swallowed hard, unable to look him in the eye. He stepped aside while Frank reached into the engine compartment, his hands steady and sure as ever. Frank worked in silence for a while, his flashlight cutting through the steam rising from the engine. Ryan stood beside him awkwardly, unsure what to say. The only sounds were the hum of cicadas and the soft click of tools as Frank loosened a clamp and adjusted the belt tension. Finally, Frank broke the silence. Looks like your alternator's giving out, he said. You're lucky it didn't happen farther from town. Ryan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. You still fixing my messes, huh? Frank glanced up. I fix cars, not people's egos, but sometimes the two get tangled. Ryan gave a small, shameful laugh. Yeah, I earned that. Frank didn't answer. He just kept working, his movements calm and deliberate. There was no resentment in him, no judgment, just quiet focus. Watching him, Ryan felt something strange twist in his chest. The last time he'd seen those hands, he'd been mocking them. Now, he watched them move with a precision that came from decades of patience and purpose. After a few 10 minutes, Frank straightened up and wiped his hands. Try the ignition, he said. Ryan slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine coughed once, then roared back to life. Relief washed over him, followed by something deeper, something like humility. He stepped out of the car and looked at Frank. I don't know how to thank you. Frank shrugged. A simple thank you works. Ryan nodded. You know, I've replayed that day at the shop in my head 100 times. Every time I think of something different I should have said, or not said. Frank smiled faintly. That's how learning works. Ryan looked at the ground. You had every right to tell me to get lost tonight, but you didn't. Frank leaned against the side of the car, his expression gentle. If I turned people away for every mistake they made, I'd have no one left to help. Besides, he added, with a half grin, you're a good reminder for my students about why character matters more than cars. Ryan chuckled softly. Guess I'm famous for the wrong reasons again. Frank shook his head. Not if you do something about it. The words lingered in the night air. Ryan looked up, the distant streetlights reflecting in his eyes. You really think people can change? I don't think, Frank said. I've seen it. Engines, people, lives. They all seize up sometimes. Doesn't mean they're done. Just means they need a little work. Ryan's throat tightened. Maybe I needed this breakdown more than I thought. Frank gave him a knowing nod. Most people do. A long silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that settles after truth has been spoken. Finally, Ryan reached out his hand. Frank took it without hesitation. Thank you, Ryan said quietly. Frank smiled. Take care of the car and yourself. As Ryan drove off into the night, he glanced in the mirror and saw Frank's truck parked on the starred shoulder, the older man silhouetted by his headlights. For the first time in years, Ryan didn't feel like someone on top of the world. He just felt human, and it was enough. A few weeks passed after that night on the highway. The encounter with Frank lingered in Ryan's mind, like a song he couldn't stop hearing. He had driven home in silence, the sound of the repaired engine humming beneath him, steady and alive. That night, for the first time in years, he didn't scroll through his phone or check for likes or comments. Instead, he sat by his window and thought about what Frank had said, how engines, people, and lives all need work sometimes. In the days that followed, something shifted. The noise of social media no longer pulled him in. His old videos felt hollow. His words, once slick and confident, now rang false in his own ears. He started watching tutorials instead of marketing clips, fascinated by the quiet craftsmanship of mechanics, welders, and carpenters, people who built things that lasted. One morning, curiosity led him to Pasadena. He had read an article about the Keanu Reeves Foundation's new training center and the man they called its heart and hands, Frank Mallory. The piece described how Frank, a humble small-town mechanic, was now teaching young people not only how to fix engines, but also how to value work itself. Ryan parked across the street from the building and watched from inside his car. Through the wide glass windows, he could see rows of students gathered around workbenches, tools gleaming under bright white lights. Frank stood at the center, calm and grounded as always, guiding a student's hand as they tightened a bolt. The students listened with the kind of attention Ryan once craved, but never earned. He stepped out of his car, hesitating for a long moment before crossing the street. Inside, the familiar smell of oil and metal filled the air. He stood quietly near the doorway, unnoticed, watching as Frank moved from one student to the next. The sound of clinking tools and quiet laughter filled the workshop. Frank finally looked up and spotted him. He didn't frown or look surprised. Instead, he gave a small nod, as if he had been expecting him all along. "Didn't think I'd see you here," he said. Ryan swallowed hard. "I wanted to see what this place was about. I read the article." Frank smiled faintly. "It's about giving kids a shot at something real. They come here to build things and themselves." Ryan nodded slowly. "They seem happy." "They are," Frank said. "It's hard not to be when you're doing something that matters." Ryan walked closer, his gaze drifting to the students, working on an old V8 engine. "You really think they can make a life doing this?" Frank chuckled. "They don't just make a living, they make meaning." Ryan stood silent for a long moment. The sound of laughter and focus filled the air, an orchestra of dignity. He finally said softly, "I was wrong." Frank turned to face him fully. "About what?" "About everything," Ryan said. "About what matters. About people like you. I thought I was building something with my life, but I was just chasing noise." Frank studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Then you learned the hardest lesson, respect." Ryan exhaled, his voice trembling just slightly. "Guess I'm still learning." Frank smiled. "Good. That means you're alive." Frank gestured for Ryan to follow him toward the back of the workshop, where a few of his students were working on an old pickup truck. They were laughing as they passed tools to one another, their hands greasy, their clothes marked with smudges of hard work. "See that?" Frank said quietly. "That's pride. Not the kind you show off, the kind you earn." Ryan nodded slowly. "They don't even know who I am." Frank smiled. "That's probably why you like it here." Ryan laughed under his breath. "Yeah, maybe that's exactly it." They stood for a while in companionable silence, watching the students work. The young woman from earlier, Sarah, wiped her hands and called over, "Mr. Mallory, the timing's off again." Every mistake makes the next repair cleaner. Ryan watched her grin and dive back into the task, her determination reminding him of something he hadn't felt in years. He turned back to Frank. "You're doing something good here. Better than anything I ever built." Frank shook his head. "You're giving me too much credit. This place isn't about me. It's about giving people a chance to believe in what they can do. That's all." Ryan hesitated. "I wish I'd figured that out sooner." "Maybe you weren't ready yet," Frank said simply. "Sometimes life has to knock us off the road before we remember where we were supposed to be going." Those words settled deep into Ryan's chest. He looked around the shop one more time at the mural on the wall. The words, "Every tool tells a story," glowing under the lights. For the first time in a long while, he wanted to be part of something without needing his name on it. Later that evening, long after the students had gone home, Ryan returned quietly. The center lights were dimmed, and the night was cool. He carried with him a set of unopened crates, each one filled with brand new diagnostic scanners, calibration tools, and compressors. He left them neatly stacked at the entrance, with only a small note taped to one box. "For the next generation of hands that build the world, a friend." When Frank arrived the next morning, he found the crates waiting. He picked up the note and smiled, recognizing the handwriting instantly. Maggie, who was helping organize the day's lessons, read the message and grinned. "Anonymous donor, huh?" Frank tucked the note into his shirt pocket. "Yeah," he said softly. "Let's keep it that way." That afternoon, Keanu stopped by for a visit. He was wearing his usual jeans and worn leather boots, blending in as easily as ever. He noticed the new equipment lined up by the wall and raised an eyebrow. "Looks like Christmas came early." Frank handed him the note. Keanu read it, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his jacket. "He came around," Keanu said with a quiet smile. Frank nodded. "Took a while, but he did." Keanu looked around at the students, now using the new tools with excitement, and his voice softened. "That's how we start to fix the world, one person at a time," Frank smiled. "One tune-up at a time," Keanu chuckled. That too. The two men stood side by side, watching the young mechanics work, the sound of wrenches and laughter filling the air again. For all the noise the world made, It was this a room full of purpose, kindness, and second chances that truly spoke the loudest. As the sun dipped behind the glass walls of the center, Frank placed his hand on the workbench, feeling the hum of life returning through the tools and through the people who used them. For the first time in a long while, everything felt exactly the way it should. The night of the ceremony arrived with the glow of city lights spilling across downtown Pasadena. The auditorium was filled with hundreds of people, students, educators, community leaders, and families gathered for the annual State Awards for Technical Education and Community Service. It was the kind of event Frank never imagined himself attending, let alone being honored at. He sat near the front, awkward in a new gray suit Maggie had insisted he buy. The fabric felt stiff, the collar a little too tight, but she had smiled and said, "You deserve to look the part tonight." Around him, banners hung from the rafters with words like innovation, craftsmanship, dedication. But it was the sign on the podium that caught his eye, celebrating hands that build the future. Frank exhaled slowly. The phrase alone made his throat tighten. Behind the stage curtain, Keanu was talking quietly with the event organizers. When he stepped into view, a quiet ripple of whispers ran through the crowd, followed by warm applause. He wore a black suit, simple and unassuming, his hair pulled back, his expression calm but proud. When he reached the microphone, the room fell into an expectant hush. "Good evening," Keanu began. "Tonight, we're not celebrating fame or fortune. We're celebrating something the world too often forgets: work. Real work. The kind that doesn't happen in front of cameras, but behind them. The kind that builds, repairs, and teaches." His words hung in the air, resonating through the hall. He continued, "Years ago, I met a man who reminded me of what honesty looks like when you hold it in your hands. He didn't chase recognition or praise. He just kept showing up day after day, year after year, fixing what others thought was beyond repair, not just engines, but people's faith in goodness." Maggie smiled from her seat, her eyes shining. Ryan, sitting quietly near the back, leaned forward, listening closely. He was dressed modestly now, wearing no watch, no brand names, no sunglasses, just a simple black shirt and an expression of quiet reflection. Keanu looked out over the crowd, his voice steady. "This man showed me that real heroes don't wear suits. They wear overalls. Their hands are calloused, their backs are tired, but their hearts, they're full." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Keanu smiled gently. "Please, welcome Mr. Frank Mallory." The applause began softly, then grew into a roar that filled the hall. Frank stood, his legs unsteady, and made his way to the stage. As he walked, flashes from cameras caught the shine of his silver hair and the humble disbelief in his eyes. He reached the podium, shaking Keanu's hand firmly. Keanu leaned in and whispered, "You earned this, Frank." Frank's voice was low as he replied, "You made it possible." Keanu smiled and stepped aside, holding out the award plaque. The lights reflected off the polished wood and engraved lettering that read, "For outstanding service in technical education and community dedication, Frank Mallory." The audience stood, clapping louder. Frank looked down at the plaque, his reflection faint in its golden surface. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he looked up, his voice trembling just enough to remind everyone that this moment was real. "I don't have fancy words," he said softly, gripping the microphone, "but I do have gratitude." Frank looked out at the audience, his eyes scanning the sea of faces. He saw his students sitting in the second row, wearing their workshop uniforms with pride. Some of them held their phones high, recording the moment. Maggie sat near them, tears glinting in her eyes. Toward the back, Ryan was clapping quietly, his expression humble but sincere. Frank took a shaky breath. "Most of my life," he began, "I thought people like me didn't get remembered. I was fine with that. I fixed cars, changed oil, rebuilt engines, and went home tired, but honest. Never thought that mattered to anyone outside the folks who drove away with their cars running again." He paused, his hands trembling slightly as he held the plaque. Then one day, a man came into my garage and reminded me that work, real work, is worth more than applause. He stood up for me when I didn't have the words to defend myself. And because of that, I'm standing here tonight. The room was silent. Even the photographers lowered their cameras. Frank smiled faintly. This award doesn't belong to me alone. It belongs to every pair of hands that's ever been covered in grease or dirt or paint or sweat. It belongs to everyone who's ever been told they're just workers when, in truth, they're the ones keeping this whole world running. The audience erupted into applause again, the sound rolling through the hall like thunder. Frank waited for it to quiet before continuing. "I don't know much about speeches," he said with a nervous laugh, "but I do know something about promises. I made one a long time ago to live my life helping others. Tonight, I think I finally kept it." He glanced upward, his voice softening. "And if Marianne's listening, this one's for you." He raised the plaque slightly, the light catching it just right, and whispered, "For Marianne." The audience stood again, some wiping tears from their eyes. Maggie clapped until her hands hurt. Keanu stepped forward and placed a steady hand on Frank's shoulder. "You did her proud," he said quietly. Frank nodded, emotion thick in his throat. "I think she'd have liked this place," he said. "All the noise, all the young faces learning something real." "She would," Keanu replied. Down in the audience, Ryan stood, clapping softly but with genuine respect. He didn't try to approach the stage or make himself seen. He simply stood in the back, grateful to witness what grace looked like when it came full circle. The ceremony closed with a montage of the year's highlights photos of students, workshops, and community volunteers. But when Frank's image appeared on the big screen, standing in front of the training center mural beneath the words, "Every tool tells a story," the applause returned once more. After the ceremony, people lined up to shake Frank's hand. Reporters asked for quotes, but he just smiled and said, "I already said everything I needed to." As the crowd began to thin, Keanu found him standing near the side exit, looking down at the plaque again. "Still doesn't feel real, does it?" Keanu asked. Frank shook his head. "No, but it feels right." Keanu smiled. "That's better." They stepped out into the cool night, the air filled with distant city sounds and the hum of passing traffic. Frank looked up at the stars, the award tucked under his arm, and took a deep breath. "Funny thing," he said softly. "I used to think the best thing I'd ever build was an engine." Keanu looked at him. "You built something better, Frank. You built people." Frank smiled, his eyes shining. "Guess that's what lasts the longest." The morning sun bathed the training center in warm, golden light. The roll-up doors were open, letting in the soft breeze of a California spring. Inside, the familiar sounds of tools clicking, engines humming, and laughter filled the air. The smell of oil and metal mixed with the sweetness of blooming orange trees just outside the fence. Frank Mallory stood at the center of it all, grease still under his fingernails, a faint smudge across his cheek. His hair had grown a little whiter, his steps a little slower, but there was something new in his eyes, something bright, steady, and full of peace. Around him, a dozen students worked together in pairs, rebuilding engines, polishing parts, and testing circuits. They weren't just learning mechanics, they were learning patience, respect, and pride in their craft. He leaned over, one student's shoulder, watching closely as the young man struggled with a wrench that refused to turn. "Don't force it," Frank said gently. "Listen to the metal. It'll tell you how much it can take." The student tried again, adjusting his grip. The bolt loosened with a satisfying click. "Like that?" Frank smiled. "Exactly. Everything worth fixing needs a little care first." Nearby, Maggie was helping organize parts in labeled bins. She had officially joined the staff months ago, running administration for the program, but everyone in the building knew she was the soul that kept it running smoothly. She glanced toward Frank and smiled to herself. "He was born for this," she murmured. That afternoon, the rumble of a motorcycle echoed through the courtyard. Heads turned as the familiar black helmet came into view. Keanu Reeves pulled up beside the main entrance, dust shimmering in the sunlight as he parked. The students froze, whispering among themselves with awe and disbelief. Frank just chuckled. "You'd think they'd never seen a man ride before," he said, shaking his head. Keanu removed his helmet, his signature calm smile crossing his face. "Morning, Frank," he said as he walked in. "Heard the next generation of mechanics is making history in here." Frank wiped his hands and shook his head modestly. "They're making something better than history. They're making a future." Keanu glanced around, admiring the sight. Young men and women from all backgrounds, sleeves rolled up, faces focused, working together. There was a rhythm to the room, a kind of harmony that words couldn't describe. He watched as one student helped another align a carburetor, their laughter echoing softly between the metal walls. "You built this," Keanu said quietly. Frank shook his head. "No, we built this." Keanu smiled, looking up at the mural on the far wall. The sunlight hit it perfectly, illuminating the words that had come to define the place. "Every tool tells a story." He turned back to Frank. "You know," he said softly, "I think this is what work's supposed to look like. Not just labor, not just survival, but respect. Work isn't just what we do, it's how we honor each other." Frank nodded, his gaze sweeping across the room. "You taught me that too." Keanu smiled quietly, his eyes reflecting the same deep gratitude. "No, Frank, you reminded me." As the day went on, the shop filled with the kind of noise that only peace can make, the steady hum of purpose. Frank moved from station to station, checking torque measurements, testing valve responses, offering small corrections that made big differences. Every now and then, a student would grin and say, "Thanks, mister." Mallory, and every time, he'd give the same quiet reply, "Just pass it on." Keanu walked along the workshop floor, his steps unhurried. He stopped to watch a group of students polishing a rebuilt engine until it gleamed. They were talking, laughing, proud of their work. He could see what Frank had built here, not a school, not a brand, but a community stitched together by the simple belief that effort has dignity. He turned toward Frank again. "Do you ever think about retiring?" he asked lightly. Frank laughed, wiping his hands with a towel. "From what? Living?" Keanu grinned. "Fair point." Frank leaned against the workbench, watching his students. "If you'd told me a year ago that I'd be teaching in California, I'd have laughed you out of my shop. But now, I can't imagine doing anything else." Maggie joined them with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Frank. "You've earned this, old man," she said playfully. Frank smiled, taking a sip. "I didn't earn it alone." Keanu looked at the students again, their faces glowing under the bright skylight. "That's the beauty of it, Frank. None of us do." The afternoon sun poured through the open doors, painting the shop floor gold. Outside, the palm trees swayed gently. And somewhere nearby, the faint hum of traffic blended with the mechanical rhythm of the workshop. Keanu walked over to the doorway, taking one last look at the space. The laughter, the tools, the motion, the meaning. He turned back to Frank and said quietly, "You know, this place doesn't just fix engines. It fixes faith." Frank met his eyes. "Faith in what?" "In people," Keanu said. "In decency, in work that means something." Frank nodded slowly, feeling the truth of it. "Yeah, maybe that's all any of us can really build." Keanu smiled. "And that's enough." The 2 men stood there for a long moment, side by side, the hum of the workshop wrapping around them like music. Then Keanu slipped his hands into his jacket pockets and headed for the door. As he stepped into the sunlight, he looked back once more and said softly, "Every tool tells a story, Frank. You just made yours one worth hearing." Frank chuckled, calling out after him, "Then you'd better make a movie about it." Keanu laughed, his voice fading as he walked toward his motorcycle. Some stories don't need movies, they just need to be remembered. When the sound of the engine faded down the street, the shop returned to its rhythm. Frank turned back to his students, clapping his hands once. "All right, folks, break's over. Let's get back to work." The students smiled and hurried back to their stations. The air buzzed again with focus and laughter. Frank stood for a moment, watching them, the golden light reflecting off the mural behind him. His voice, calm and sure, echoed through the workshop. Keep those engines honest, and keep yourselves honest. That's how you build something that lasts. The scene lingered on the mural. Every tool tells a story. The camera slowly zoomed in as the sounds of the workshop faded into gentle music. Then Keanu's voice came through, soft and thoughtful, as if speaking directly to the audience. Work isn't just what we do, it's how we honor each other. And maybe, somewhere in your life, there's someone like Frank. Someone who works quietly, without recognition, holding the world together, one bolt at a time. Have you ever met someone whose hard work went unnoticed? Share their story below. Because respect shouldn't depend on status, it should depend on heart. The screen faded to black, the mural's words glowing one last time before the video ended.